So just what does it mean to be a Tolkien fan anyway? And is there a difference between being a Tolkien fan and a Middle-earth fan? I ask these questions because it's been a very interesting past few weeks in the public discourse surrounding all things Middle-earth. For one thing, most recently we got the drop of the new teaser trailer for Season 2 of The Rings of Power, something I'm personally quite excited about because if you're a regular viewer of my channel, you know that I love that show, and I've started producing content to defend it because I love it so much. But on top of that, we also got news that Warner Brothers will be producing their own new Lord of the Rings movies, the first one being called The Hunt for Gollum, being produced by Peter Jackson and directed by Andy Serkis, who will presumably be renewing his role as Gollum. That movie is going to be based on a single paragraph in The Lord of the Rings. And in the background of all of that, we have the Embracer Group, which quietly purchased almost all of the motion picture, gaming, and other merchandising rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit back in 2022, a move which I think is driving a lot of all the other license holders or licensees producing all of this new Lord of the Rings content. You see, Warner Brothers, over there with Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis, are making new Lord of the Rings movies in large part because they want to maintain their license to do so, which they purchased from Middle-earth Enterprises, now owned by the Embracer Group. If they don't make new Lord of the Rings content, they will lose that license and, therefore, a significant revenue stream, at least in their eyes. But the catch there is that any new content they make that's stamped as Middle-earth or Lord of the Rings has to be adapted from the movies that they've already made back in the aughts, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Hobbit trilogy. They cannot adapt the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, or any of the other supplemental materials put forward by Christopher Tolkien and Guy Gavriel Kay in the wake of J.R.R. Tolkien's death. A similar situation exists over at Amazon Prime with The Rings of Power. They're only able to produce that show because they entered into an agreement directly with the Tolkien estate, who maintain veto authority over everything in that show. Technically, on paper, Amazon has the TV and streaming rights to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the appendices to those books. They also cannot adapt, at least not directly, the Silmarillion or any other parts of the Legendarium, although the Tolkien estate can give them permission on a case-by-case basis to adapt other bits of the Legendarium outside of that agreement. Now, on top of all that, the Embracer Group has the right to produce its own series of movies, as well as video games, role-playing games, merchandise, and so forth, around the Lord of the Rings. And they said in their press release that they will probably start making their own movies about characters from within the Lord of the Rings, like Aragorn or Gandalf or Éowyn. The Embracer Group also only has the rights to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, not to the Silmarillion. So we're in this really interesting place where it's become possible to be a fan of one of these versions of Middle-earth without engaging any of the other versions. We now have 4 distinct Middle-earth continuities circulating in pop culture. There's the original Legendarium, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, those novels, along with the supplemental materials, the Silmarillion, and so forth. And those will always be there, unchanging. We have Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power continuity. We have Warner Brothers, I guess you could call it the Jacksonverse continuity, which has significant differences from the Legendarium, both in terms of character design, plotting, and theme. And we have the Embracer Group and whatever they're going to be doing with their license for the Lord of the Rings. So it can be a little overwhelming, I think. And a lot of people who identify as Tolkien fans are kind of upset about it. I guess understandably so. I've counted myself as a Tolkien fan for most of my life. There is no period of my life, all the way back to the before time, in the long, long ago. There's not a single moment of my life I can recall not having been aware of and in love with the world that Tolkien created. I am a Tolkien fan, or am I? Because I also love The Rings of Power. I loved Peter Jackson's movies. I've enjoyed what I've seen of the video games, The Shadows of Mordor and Shadows of War, etc. Basically, if it's about Middle-earth, I am interested in it. So, I think we've reached a point in the history of Middle-earth as a narrative legacy where we have to choose. Are we just Tolkien fans, or are we Middle-earth fans? That may seem like a distinction without a difference to some of you, but I don't think it is. Because the fact that the narrative rights to this world are so scattered and so confusing and so labyrinthine that we can now have 4 distinct Middle-earth continuities in pop culture, possibly more in the future, is a turning point for the very concept of Middle-earth. And I know that a lot of people aren't happy about it. In my own videos where I defend the Rings of Power and give it positive reviews, I have people turn up in my comments section from time to time arguing that the show is a bastardization of Tolkien's legacy because Tolkien's aspiration was to create a myth for the Anglo-Saxon people that would rival the mythic cycles of like the sagas and the Eddas for the Germanic people, or the stories of the gods and heroes from Greek and Roman mythology and so forth. He wanted to create something that could serve as that legacy for the English people, specifically for Anglo-Saxon people. And I think the mistake a lot of fans who make that argument make is thinking that being a myth cycle for the Anglo-Saxon people means being a myth cycle for white people, which is not what it means. But I think they also think it means that no one can ever do anything new with Middle-earth. That in order to honor the professor's aspiration to create a myth for English people, that story can never be tampered with. It has to remain pristine, the way Tolkien wrote it, and never ever deviated from by anyone else. And frankly, I think that violates the spirit, if not the actual plainly stated intention, of Professor Tolkien himself. He did, after all, recognize in his own letters that the narrative legacy of Middle-earth would one day be the stewards, or in the stewardship of, other minds and other hands. He understood well the concept of the cauldron of story that he mentioned in his essay on fairy stories. He must have understood that at some point, if his aspiration were successful, his stories would re-enter the cauldron of story, and future generations would tell new stories about Aragorn and Frodo and Galadriel and Ents and orcs and Middle-earth, and those stories inevitably would be unrecognizable to him. I think that's a good thing. I think it shows that the world Tolkien created resonates with people so much that we all want more of it, and Tolkien himself can never produce more of it. It has to fall to future generations, and like it or not, new media properties inspired by Tolkien, produced by mega corporations under late-stage capitalism, is just the way that new stories are going to be told for the foreseeable future. And just as we still tell stories today about Hercules or Thor or King Arthur, and we retell them in ways that are relevant to our concerns in the here and now, so too will future stories of Middle-earth. Myth is not literature. Literature does not change. Sure, you can find new meanings within it, but the text remains the same pretty much for all time. Myth, however, does change. Myth develops in dialogue with politics, with culture, with economics, even with geography and climate, and a whole bunch of other external factors that shape what people want from stories. So they will tell stories that feel familiar to them, that feature characters they love, but they will reshape those characters and those settings to reflect what we're concerned about now, not what the authors were concerned about 50 or 70 years ago. So that's in part why I take heart at the existence of things like the Rings of Power, or the Hunt for Gollum, or whatever new Middle-earth properties are produced by Embracer Group or Warner Brothers or Amazon. Whether they're good or not is a separate discussion. Whether Tolkien himself would approve of these new stories is irrelevant to whether he successfully achieved his aspiration. The fact that we have all of this new Middle-earth material coming out shows that he was successful, that he created a world and characters that will resonate with generations for centuries to come. And that, my friends, is why I'm no longer a Tolkien fan, I am a Middle-earth fan, and I invite you to join me in the Middle-earth fandom. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, etc., etc. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women. Namarie.